Srimad Bhagavatam 11th Canto, Part 2, Chapter 13. The Haṁsa-avatāra answers the questions of the sons of Brahmā. In this chapter, Lord Śrī Kṛṣṇa explains to Uddhava how human beings, overwhelmed by sense gratification, become bound by the three modes of nature, and how to renounce these modes. The Lord then describes how he appeared in his form as Haṁsa before Brahmā and the four sages headed by Sanaka, and revealed to them various confidential truths. The three modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance, are related to material intelligence, not to the soul. One should conquer the lower modes of passion and ignorance by the mode of goodness, and then one must surpass the mode of goodness by acting the transcendental mode of pure goodness. By associating with things in the mode of goodness, one becomes more fully situated in that mode. The three modes increase their different influences through various types of scripture: water, place, time, beneficiaries of activity, natures of activity, birth, meditation, mantra, purificatory rituals, and so on. Lacking discrimination, one identifies with the material body, and consequently the mode of passion which produces misery takes over the mind, which is normally in the mode of goodness. Lacking discrimination, one identifies with the material body, and consequently the mode of passion which produces misery takes over the mind, which is normally in the mode of goodness. As the mind evolves its function of decision and doubt, it creates intolerable hankerings for sense gratification. Unfortunate persons who are bewildered by the urge of the mode of passion become the slaves of their senses. Even though they know that the eventual result of their work will be suffering, they cannot avoid engaging in such fruitive work. A discriminating person, on the other hand, keeps himself detached from the objects of the senses, and by utilizing appropriate renunciation, takes shelter of unalloyed devotional service. Lord Brahmā himself has no material cause. He is the cause of the creation of all living beings, and is the greatest among all the demigods. Yet even Brahmā is always suffering agitation of the mind, and on account of the duties he has to perform. Therefore, when he was questioned by his sons, headed by Sanaka, who were born from his mind, about the means for driving away desires from sense gratification, he was incapable of giving them an answer. In order to receive some insight into this matter, he took shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, whereupon the Supreme Lord appeared before him in the form of the swan incarnation, Lord Haṁsa. Lord Haṁsa proceeded to give instructions about the categorical identity of the self, the different states of consciousness, wakefulness, sleep, and deep sleep, and the means for conquering our material existence. The sages headed by Sanaka became freed from all their doubts by hearing the words of the Lord, and worshipped him with pure devotion and mature love of God. Text 1. Śrī Bhagavan Vacha Sattvam Rajastama iti Guna Bhatirna Chatmanaha Sattvena Anyatmao Hanyat Sattvam Sattvena Chaivahi. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the three modes of material nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance, pertain to material intelligence, and not to the spiritual soul. By development of material goodness, one can conquer the modes of passion and ignorance, and by cultivation of transcendental goodness, one may free oneself even from material goodness. Purport. Goodness in the material world never exists in a pure form. Never it is common knowledge that on the material platform no one is working without personal motivation. In the material world, goodness is always mixed with some amount of passion and ignorance, whereas spiritual or purified goodness, Vishuddha Sattva, represents the liberated platform of perfection. Materially, One is proud to be an honest, compassionate man, but unless one is fully Krishna conscious, one will speak truths that are not ultimately significant, and one will give mercy that is ultimately useless. Because the onward march of material time removes all situations and persons from the material stage, our so-called mercy and truth apply to situations that shortly will not exist. Real truth is eternal, and real mercy means to situate people in eternal truth. Still, for an ordinary person, cultivation of material goodness may be a preliminary stage on the road to Krishna consciousness. For example, it is stated in the 10th canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, that one who is addicted to meat eating cannot understand the pastimes of Lord Krishna. By cultivation of the material mode of goodness, however, one may become a vegetarian and perhaps come to appreciate the sublime process of Krishna consciousness. It is clearly stated in Bhagavad Gita that the material modes of nature constantly rotate. One must take advantage of an elevated position in material goodness to step onto the transcendental platform. Otherwise, as the wheel of time turns, one will again go into the darkness of material ignorance. Text 2. Sattva dharmo bhavet vrithat pumsomad bhakti lakshanaha sattviko pasaya sattvam tato dharmaha pravartate. Translation: when the living entity becomes strongly situated in the mode of goodness, then religious principles, characterized by devotional service to me, become prominent. One can strengthen the mode of goodness by cultivation of those things that are already situated in goodness, and thus religious principles arise. When the living entity becomes strongly situated in the mode of goodness, then religious principles characterized by devotional service to me become prominent. Purport: since the three modes of material nature are constantly in conflict, vying for supremacy, how is it possible that the mode of goodness can subdue the modes of passion and ignorance? Lord Krishna here explains how one can be strongly fixed in the mode of goodness, which automatically gives rise to religious principles. In the 14th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna elaborately explains the things that are in goodness, passion, and ignorance. Thus, by choosing food, attitudes, work, recreation, etc. strictly in the mode of goodness, one will become situated in that mode. The usefulness of sattva guna, or the mode of goodness, is that it produces religious principles aimed at and characterized by devotional service to Lord Krishna. Without such devotional service to the Lord, the mode of goodness is considered useless and merely another aspect of material illusion. The word vrithat, or strengthened, increased, indicates clearly that one should come to the platform of Vishuddha Sattva, or purified goodness. The word vrithat indicates growth, and growth should not be stopped until full maturity is reached. The full maturity of goodness is called Vishuddha Sattva, the transcendental platform on which there is no trace of any other quality. In pure goodness, all knowledge automatically manifests, and one can easily understand one's eternal loving relationship with Lord Krishna. That is the actual meaning and purpose of Dharma, or religious principles. Srimad Bhagavatam points out in this regard that an increase in the mode of goodness strengthens religious principles, and the invigorated execution of religious principles strengthens the mode of goodness. In that way, one can advance higher and higher in the mode of spiritual happiness. Text 3. Dharmo rajas tamo hanyat sattva vritir anuttamaha asunasyati tanmula hya dharma ubhayihate. Translation: religious principles strengthened by the mode of goodness destroy the influence of passion and ignorance. Religious principles strengthened by the mode of goodness destroy the influence of passion and ignorance. When passion and ignorance are overcome, their original cause, irreligion, is quickly vanquished. Text 4. Agamopaha prajadeshaha kalaha karma cha janma cha dhyanam mantrota samskaro dashaite gunahetavaha. Translation. According to the quality of religious scriptures, water, one's association with one's children, or with people in general, the particular place, the time, activities, birth, meditation, chanting of mantras, and purificatory rituals, the modes of nature, become different and prominent. Purport. The 10 items mentioned above possess superior and inferior qualities and are thus identified as being in goodness, passion, or ignorance. One can increase the mode of goodness by selecting religious scriptures in goodness, pure water, friendship with other persons in goodness, and so on. One should scrupulously avoid any of these 10 items that may be polluted by an inferior mode of good nature. Text 5. Tat tat satvikam me vaisham yat yat vrithaha prachakshate nindanti tamsam tat tat rajasam tat upekshitam. Translation. Among the 10 items I have just mentioned, the great sages who understand Vedic knowledge have praised and recommended those that are in the mode of goodness, criticized and rejected those in the mode of ignorance, and shown indifference to those in the mode of passion. Text 6. Satvikang eva sevita pumang sattva viridhaye tato dharmas tato jnanam yavat smritir apohanam. Translation. Until one receives one's direction, knowledge, until one revives one's direct knowledge of the spirit soul and drives away the illusory identification with the material body and mind caused by the free modes of nature, one must cultivate those things in the mode of goodness. By increasing the mode of goodness, one automatically can understand and practice religious principles, and by such practice transcendental knowledge is awakened. Purport. One who desires to cultivate the mode of goodness must consider the following points. One should study religious scriptures that teach detachment from mental speculation and material sense gratification, not scriptures that provide rituals and mantras to increase material ignorance. Such materialistic scriptures do not give attention to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and thus are basically atheistic. One should accept pure water for quenching thirst and cleaning the body. That is, no need for a devotee to use colognes, perfumes, whiskey, beer, etc., which are all polluted manifestations of water. One should associate with persons who are cultivating detachment from the material world, and not with those who are material attached or sinful in their behavior. One should live in a solitary place where devotional service is practiced and discussed among Vaishnavas. One should not be spontaneously attracted to busy highways, shopping centers, sports, stadiums, and so on. Conquering time, one should rise by 4 o'clock in the morning and utilize the auspicious Brahmā Muhurta to advance in Krishna consciousness. Similarly, one should avoid the sinful influence of hours such as midnight, when ghosts and demons are encouraged to become active. Concerning work, one should execute one's prescribed duties, follow the regulated principles of spiritual life, and utilize all of one's energy for pious purposes. Time should not be wasted in frivolous or materialistic activities, of which there are now literally millions in modern society. One can cultivate birth in the mode of goodness by accepting the second birth of initiation from a bona fide spiritual master and learning to chant the Hare Krishna mantra. One should not accept initiation or so-called spiritual birth in an unauthorized mystical or religious cults in the mode of passion and ignorance. One should meditate upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead as the enjoyer of full sacrifice, and similarly, one should meditate on the lives of great devotees and saintly persons. One should not meditate on lusty women and envious men. Concerning mantras, one should follow the example of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu by chanting the Hare Krishna mantra and not other songs, verses, poetry, or mantras that glorify the kingdom of illusion. Purificatory rituals should be performed to purify the spirit soul and not to bring down material blessings on one's material household. One who increases the mode of goodness will certainly become fixed in religious principles, and automatically knowledge will arise. As knowledge increases, one is able to understand the eternal spirit soul and the Supreme Soul, Lord Krishna. Thus the soul becomes free from the artificial imposition of the gross and subtle material bodies caused by the modes of material nature. Spiritual knowledge burns to ashes the material designations that cover the living entity, and one's real eternal life begins. Text 7. Venu Sangha Gangra Sangra Sajo Vaknir Daktva Samyati Tatvanam Evam Guna Vyatyaya Yojo Deha Samyati Tatkriyaha. Translation. In a bamboo forest, the wind sometimes rubs the bamboo stalks together, and such friction generates a blazing fire that consumes the very source of its birth, the bamboo forest. Thus the fire is automatically calmed by its own action. Similarly, by the competition and interaction of the material modes of nature, the subtle and gross material bodies are generated. If one uses his mind and body to cultivate knowledge, then such enlightenment destroys the influence of the modes of nature that generated one's body. Thus, like the fire, the body and mind are pacified by their own actions in destroying the source of their birth. Purport. The word guna Vyatyaya Jaha is significant in this verse. Vyatyaya indicates change or inversion in the normal order of things. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has described the concept of Vyatyaya by giving the Sanskrit synonym Vaishamya, which indicates inequality or disproportionate diversity. Thus it is understood by the term guna Vyatyaya Jaha that the body is generated by the unstable relationships of the three modes. Thus it is understood by the term guna Vyatyaya Jaha that the body is generated by the unstable relationships of three modes of material nature, which exist everywhere in constantly changing proportions. There is constant strife among the modes of nature. A good person is sometimes torn by passion, and a passionate person sometimes wants to give up everything and rest. An ignorant person may sometimes become disgusted with his depraved life, and a passionate person may sometimes indulge in bad habits in the mode of ignorance. Due to the interactive conflict of the modes of nature, one wanders throughout material nature, creating one body after another by one's own work, karma. As it is said, variety is the mother of enjoyment, and the variety of material modes gives hope to the conditioned souls that by changing their material situation, their unhappiness and frustration can be turned into happiness and satisfaction. But even if one acquires relative material happiness, that will soon be disturbed by the inevitable flux of the material modes. Text 8. Shri Uddhava Vacha Vidanti Martyaha Prayena Vishayan Padma Padam Tathapi Bhujate Krishna Tatkatham Svakhara Javad. Translation. Uddhava said, My dear Krishna, generally human beings know that material life brings great future unhappiness, and still they try to enjoy material life. My dear Lord, how can one in knowledge act just like a dog, an ass, or a goat? Purport. The standard method of enjoyment in the material world are sex, money, and false prestige, all of which are obtained with great suffering and eventually lost. One engaged in material life suffers in the present and has only a very black future to look forward to in the continuing cycle of birth and death. Thus how can human beings who have seen these things and know them very well continue to enjoy life like dogs, asses, and goats? Often a dog will approach a bitch for sex, but the lady dog may not be attracted and will show her teeth, snarl, and threaten the poor dog with serious injury. Still he goes about his business trying to get a little sex pleasure. Similarly, many times a dog risks being beaten and shot while stealing some food in a place where he knows he should not go. The ass is very attracted to the she-ass, but the lady ass often kicks him in the legs. Similarly, the ass master gives the ass a handful of grass, which the poor ass could get anywhere, and then burdens him with great loads. The goat is generally raised for slaughter, and even when the goat is brought into the slaughterhouse, he shamelessly goes after the lady goat to get sex pleasure. In this way, even at the risk of being shot, bitten, and slaughtered, animals persist in their foolish sense gratification. How can an educated human being commit herself to such a condemned way of life, wherein the result is practically the same as that of the animals? If by cultivating the mode of goodness one's life is filled with happiness, enlightenment, and future rewards, why would anyone cultivate the modes of passion and ignorance? This is Uddhava's question. Text 9 and 10. Shri Bhagavan Vacha Ahamiti Anyatha Buddhi Pramattasya Yatha Hridi Utsarpati Rajogoram Tato Vaikarikam Manaha Rajo Yuktasya Manasaha Sankalpaha Savikalpaha Tataha Kamagunadhyanat Dushahasyati Durmate. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, My dear Uddhava, a person bereft of intelligence first falsely identifies himself with the material body and mind, and when such false knowledge arises within one's consciousness, material passion, the cause of great suffering, pervades the mind, which by nature is situated. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, My dear Uddhava, a person bereft of intelligence first falsely identifies himself with the material body and mind, and when such false knowledge arises within one's consciousness, material passion, the cause of great suffering, pervades the mind, which by nature is situated in goodness. Then the mind contaminated by passion becomes absorbed in making and changing many plans for material advancement. Thus by constantly thinking of the modes of material nature, the foolish person is afflicted with unbearable material desires. Purport. Those who are trying to enjoy material sense gratification are not actually intelligent, although they consider themselves most intelligent. Although such foolish persons themselves criticize the miseries of material life in innumerable books, songs, newspapers, television programs, civic committees, etc., they cannot desist from material life for a single moment. The process by which one is helplessly bound in illusion is clearly described here. The materialistic person is always thinking, Oh, what a beautiful house, I wish we could buy it. Oh, what a beautiful woman, I wish I could touch her. Oh, what a powerful position, I wish I could occupy it, and so on. The words sankalpaha, sa vikalpaha indicate that a materialist is always making new plans or modifying his old plans to increase his material enjoyment. Although in his saner moment he admits that material life is full of suffering. The mind is created from the mode of goodness, as described in Sankhya philosophy, and the natural peaceful situation of the mind is pure love of Krishna, in which there is no mental disturbance, disappointment, or confusion. Artificially, the mind is dragged down to a lower platform in passion or ignorance, and thus one is never satisfied. Text 11. Karoti kamavasagaha karmani aviji tendriyaha dukkha kodarkani sampasyan rajovega vimohitaha. Translation. One who does not control the material senses comes under the control of material desires, and is thus bewildered by the strong waves of the mode of passion. Such a person executes material activities, although clearly seeing that the result will be future unhappiness. Text 12. Rajastamobhyam yadapi vidvan vikshiptadhi punaha atandrito manoyujjan dosha drishtirna sajate. Translation. Although the intelligence of a learned person may be bewildered by the modes of passion and ignorance, he should again carefully bring the mind under control. By clearly seeing the contamination of the modes of nature, he does not become attached. Text 13. Apramatto nuyujita manomai arpayan chanaihi anirvinno yatha kalam jita svaso jita sanaha. Translation. A person should be attentive and grave and never lazy or morose. Mastering the yoga procedures of breathing and sitting properly, one should practice fixing the mind on me at dawn, noon, and sunset, and thus gradually the mind should be completely absorbed in me. Text 14. Etavan yoga adishto machishnyahi sanakadibihi sarvato mana akrishya mai adha vishyate yatha. Translation. The actual yoga system as taught by my devotees, headed by Sanaka Kumara, is simply this: having withdrawn the mind from all other objects, one should directly and appropriately absorb it in me. The actual yoga system as taught by my devotees, headed by Sanaka Kumara, is simply this: having withdrawn the mind from all other objects, one should directly and appropriately absorb it in me. Purport. The word yatha, accordingly or properly, indicates that, like Uddhava, one should hear directly from Lord Krishna or his bona fide representative, and directly atha fix the mind in Lord Krishna. Text 15. Śrī Uddhava vacha yada tvam sanaka divyo yena rupena keshava yogam adishtavan etad rupam ichhami veditum. Translation. Śrī Uddhava said, My dear Keshava, at what time and in what form did you instruct the science of yoga to Sanaka and his brothers? I now desire to know about these things. Text 16. Śrī Bhagavan vacha putra hiranyagarbhasya manasaha sanakadayaha paprochu pitaram sukshmam yogasya ikantikim gatim. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, once the mental sons of Lord Brahmā, namely the sage headed by Sanaka, inquired from their father about the difficult subject matter of the supreme goal of yoga. mental sons of Lord Brahma, namely the sage headed by Sanaka. Text 17. Sanaka dyauchuho gunesh avisheshate jito gunas chetasi cha prabho katam anyonya santyago mumukshor atiti tirshoho. Translation. The sage headed by Sanaka said, O Lord, people's minds are naturally attracted to material sense objects, and similarly the sense objects in the form of desire enter within the mind. Therefore, how can a person who desires liberation, who desires to cross over activities of sense gratification, destroy this mutual relationship between the sense objects and the mind? Please explain this to us. Purport. As described above, as long as one is a conditioned soul, the modes of material nature, manifested in the form of sense objects, constantly disturb the mind, and by their harassment one is deprived of the actual perfection of life. Text 18. Śrī Bhagavan Vacha Evam Prashto Mahadevaha Swayambhur Bhavanaha Dhyayamanaha Prashna Bijam Yanapyapadyata Karmajihi. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, My dear Uddhava, Brahma himself, who is born directly from the body of the Lord, and who is the creator of all living entities within the material world, being the best of the demigods, seriously contemplated the question of his sons headed by Sanaka. The intelligence of Brahma, however, was affected by his own activities of creation, and thus he could not discover the essential answer to this question. Purport. Srila Jiva Goswami has quoted 3 verses from the 2nd canto of Srimad Bhagavatam as follows. In the 9th chapter, verse 32, Lord Krishna blessed Brahma with realized knowledge of the Lord's actual form, qualities, and activities. In the 9th chapter, verse 37, the Lord ordered Brahma to rigidly carry out the Lord's injunctions and affirmed that Brahma would thus never be bewildered in his cosmic decision-making. In the 6th chapter, verse 34, Lord Brahma assured his son Narada, O Narada, because I have caught hold of the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Hari, with great zeal, whatever I sell has never proved to have been false, nor is the progress of my mind ever deterred, nor are my senses ever degraded by temporary attachment to matter. In the present verse, in this chapter, 13th chapter of the 11th canto, Lord Krishna states that Brahma unfortunately did become bewildered by his creative functions, thus providing a great lesson to all of the Lord's empowered representatives. Although one may be elevated to an exalted position in the Lord's transcendental service, at any moment there is danger of false pride polluting one's devotional mentality. Text 819. Samam achintaya devaha prashnaparatirshaya tasyaham Haṁsa-rūpena sakasam agamam tada. Translation. Lord Brahma desired to attain the answer to the question that was puzzling him, and thus he fixed his mind on me, the Supreme Lord. At that time, in my form of Haṁsa, I became visible to Lord Brahma. Purport. Haṁsa means swan, and the specific ability of the swan is to separate a mixture of milk and water, extracting the rich milky portion. Similarly, Lord Krishna appeared as Haṁsa, or a swan, in order to separate the pure consciousness of Lord Brahma from the modes of material nature. Text 20. Drishtva mam tat upavrajya kritva padabhivandanam Brahmanam agrataha kritva paprachuko bhavaniti. Translation. Thus seeing me, the sage, placing Brahma in the lead, came forward and worshipped my lotus feet. Then they frankly asked me, Who are you? Purport. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur comments when Brahma was unable to answer the questions placed by the sage, He fixed his mind in thought of the Supreme Lord. The Lord then assumed the form of Haṁsa and appeared before Lord Brahma, and the sage proceeded to inquire about the specific identity of the Lord. Text 21. Iti aham muni bihi prashtas tattva jigyasu bistada yadavocham aham tebhyas tadut Uddhava nibodhame. Translation. My dear Uddhava, the sage, being eager to understand the ultimate truth of the yoga system, thus inquired from me. Now please hear as I explain that which I spoke unto the sage. Text 22. Vastuno yadi ananatvam ananatva atmanaha prashna idrisha katham gati tavo vipra vakturva meka ashrayaha. Translation. My dear Brahmins, if when asking me who I am, you believe that I am also a jiva soul, and that there is no ultimate difference between us, since all souls are ultimately one without individuality, then how is your question possibly or appropriate? Ultimately, what is the real situation or resting place both of yourselves and of me? My dear Brahmins, if when asking me who I am, you believe that I am also a jiva soul, and that there is no ultimate difference between us, since all souls are ultimately one without individuality, then how is your question possible or appropriate? Ultimately, what is the real situation or resting place both of yourselves and of me? Purport. Ashraya means the resting place or shelter. Lord Krishna's question, what is our actual resting place or shelter, means what is our ultimate nature or constitutional position. This is because no one can come to rest or be satisfied unless one is on one's natural position. One is in one's natural position. The example is given that one may travel all over the world, but ultimately one becomes satisfied by returning to one's own home. Similarly, a crying child is satisfied when embraced by its own mother. By inquiring about the shelter or resting place of himself and the Brahmins, the Lord is indicating the eternal constitutional position of every living entity. If Lord Krishna were also in the jiva category, and if all living entities including him were thus equal, there would be no deep purpose in one's living entity inquiring, one another answering. Only one who is in a superior position can meaningfully answer important questions. It may be argued that the bona fide spiritual master answers all the questions of the disciples, and yet the guru is in the jiva category. The answer is that the bona fide spiritual master speaks not on his own behalf, but as a representative of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is in the Vishnu category. The so-called guru speaking on his own behalf as a jiva soul is useless and is unable to meaningfully answer serious questions. Thus the sage's question, Ko Bhavan, who are you, indicates that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is eternally an individual person. And because the sage headed by Lord Brahma offered obeisance and worshipped the Lord, it is understood that he is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Lord Brahma, as the first created being in this universe, could not accept any other living entity except the Lord as worshipable. Lord Krishna's actual purpose is to explain the ultimate perfection of yoga, which the sages were desiring to know. If one becomes fixed in transcendental knowledge, the mutual attraction between the material mind and the material sense objects automatically ceases. The spiritual mind is not attracted to material objects of gratification, and thus by spiritualizing the mind, material existence automatically slackens. By questioning the propriety of the sage's question, the Lord is assuming the position of the spiritual master and preparing to give valuable instructions. One should never be envious of a bona fide spiritual master, especially if, as in the case of Lord Haṁsa, speaking to the sage headed by Brahmā and Sanaka the Guru, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself. 2. Text 23. Iti aham muni bihi prashtas tattva jigyasu bistada yadavocham aham tebhyas tadut Uddhava nibodhame. Translation. My dear Brahmins, if when asking me who I am, you believe that I am also a jiva soul, and that there is no ultimate difference between us, since all souls are ultimately one without individuality, then how is your question possible or appropriate? Ultimately, what is the real situation or resting place both of yourselves and of me? Text 23. Panchatmakeshu bhuteshu samaneshu cha vastutaha ko bhavaniti vaha prashno vacharambo hi anartaka. Translation. If by asking me, who are you, you were referring to the material body, then I must point out that all material bodies are constituted of 5 elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Thus you should have asked, who are you, 5? If you consider that all material bodies are ultimately one, being constituted essentially of the same elements, then your question is still meaningless, since there would be no deep purpose in distinguishing one body from another. Thus it appears that in asking my identity, you are merely speaking words without any real meaning or purpose. Purport. Śrīla Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains this verse as follows. In the previous verse, Lord Krishna demonstrated that if the sage accepted the impersonal philosophy that all living beings are ultimately one in all respects, their question, who are you, was meaningless, since there would be no philosophical basis to distinguish one manifestation of spirit soul from another. In this verse, the Lord refutes the false identification with the material body composed of 5 elements. If the sage accepted the body as the self, then their question was meaningless, since they would have to ask, who are you, 5? If the sage replied that although the body is composed basically of 5 elements, and these elements combine and thus form one unique substance, then the Lord has already replied to the words Samaneshu cha vastutaha. The bodies of human beings, demigods, animals, etc. are all composed of the same 5 elements and are essentially the same. Therefore the question, who are you, is ultimately meaningless. Thus if one accepts either the theory that all living entities are ultimately the same, or the theory that all living entities are ultimately non-different from their material bodies, in both cases the question of the sage is meaningless. The sage might argue that even among learned persons it is common practice to ask questions and give answers on many subjects as a part of normal life. The sage could point out that Lord Krishna also distinguished among them by his saying Vipraha or Brahmins and Vaha or your question, as expressed in this verse. In this way, it is seen that the Lord also accepts the ordinary customs of questions and answers. To answer this argument, Lord Krishna states, Vacharambho hi anarthakaha. The Lord states, my addressing you as Brahmins is merely an exhibition of words. If you are ultimately not different, I merely reciprocated with your approach to me. Therefore, if we are ultimately one, neither my statement nor your question has any real meaning. I can conclude, therefore, by your question to me, that you are all not actually very intelligent. Therefore, why are you inquiring about ultimate knowledge? Aren't you all embarrassed? Śrīla Madhvacharya points out in this regard that the question of the sages was not appropriate, since they had already seen their father, Lord Brahmā, worshipping the lotus feet of Lord Haṁsa. Since their spiritual master and father was worshipping Lord Haṁsa, they should have immediately understood the Lord's position, and their questioning is thus meaningless. Text 24. Manasa vachasa drishta griyate nyair apindriyaihi ahammiva namatonyat iti bhutyatvam ajasa. Translation. Within this world, whatever is perceived by the mind, speech, eyes, or other senses is me alone, and nothing besides me. All of you please understand this by a straightforward analysis of the facts. In this world, whatever is perceived by the mind, speech, eyes, or other senses is me alone. Purport. Lord Krishna has already explained that if the sages consider all living entities to be the same, or if they consider the living entity to be the same as his body, then their question, who are you, is inappropriate. Now the Lord refutes the conception that He is the Supreme God for far beyond and different from everything within this world. Modern agnostic philosophers preach that God created the world and then retired or went away. According to them, God has no tangible connection with this world, nor does He interfere in human affairs. Ultimately, they claim God is so great that He cannot be known. Therefore, no one should waste time trying to understand God. To refute such foolish ideas, the Lord here explains that since everything is the expansion of His potency, He is not different from anything. Nothing can exist separately from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and thus everything shares in the Lord's nature, although some manifestations are superior and others inferior. The Lord is testing the intelligence of the sage by pointing out various contradictions in their questions. Even if the Lord is supreme, He is not different from His creation. Therefore, what is the meaning of the question, "Who are you?" We can clearly see that the Lord is paving the way for a deep discussion of spiritual knowledge. Text 25. Gunesha vishati cheto gunaschetasi cha prajaha jivasyateha apayam gunascheto mad atmanaha. Translation. My dear sons, the mind has a natural proclivity to enter into the material sense objects, and similarly the sense objects enter into the mind. But both this material mind and the sense objects are merely designations that cover the spirit soul, who is part and parcel of me. Purport. The Lord, in the form of Haṁsa-avatāra, in the pretext of finding contradictions in the simple inquiry of the sons of Brahmā, "Who are you?" is actually preparing to teach the sage perfect spiritual knowledge, but only after first rejecting two false concepts of life, namely that all living entities are the same in all respects and that the living entity is identical with his outward or subtle body. Lord Krishna now answers the difficult question that puzzled even Lord Brahmā. According to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, the sons of Lord Brahmā were thinking as follows: Our dear Lord, if it is indeed true that we are unintelligent, still your Lordship has stated that you are actually everything because everything is the expansion of your potency. Therefore you are also the mind and the sense objects, which are the subject matter of our question. The material sense objects always enter into the functions of the mind, and similarly the mind always enters into the material sense objects. Thus it is proper that we inquire from your Lordship about the process by which the sense objects will no longer enter the mind, and the mind will no longer enter the sense objects. Please be merciful and give us the answer. The Lord answers as follows: My dear sons, it is a fact that the mind enters into the material sense objects, and the sense objects into the mind. Thus, although the living entity is actually part and parcel of me, being as I am also eternally conscious, and although the eternal form of the living entity is spiritual, in conditioned life the living entity artificially imposes upon himself the mind and sense objects, which act as covering designations of the eternal soul. Since it is the natural function of the material mind and sense objects to mutually interact, how can you possibly endeavor to prevent such a mutual attraction? Since both the material mind and sense objects are useless, they both should be completely given up, and thus automatically you will be free from all material duality. Srila Sridhar Swami points out that the symptom of the material mind is the tendency to consider oneself to be the ultimate doer and enjoyer. Naturally, one with such a puffed-up mentality is helplessly attracted by the sense objects. One who considers himself to be the doer and enjoyer will be irresistibly attracted to the means for attaining sense gratification and false prestige, namely exploitation of material objects. Above the material mind, however, is intelligence, which can perceive the existence of the eternal spirit soul. It is not possible to separate the material mind from the sense objects, because they naturally exist together. Therefore, by intelligence one must realize one's eternal form and spirit soul, part and parcel of the Lord, and completely reject the bogus material mentality. One who revives his original spiritual mentality becomes automatically detached from material attraction. Therefore, one should cultivate knowledge of the falsity of sense gratification. When the mind or senses are attracted to material enjoyment, the superior intelligence must immediately detect such illusion. In this way one should purify one's mentality. By devotional service to the Lord, such detachment and intelligence automatically awaken, and by full understanding of one's original spiritual form, one is properly situated in eternal consciousness. Text 26. Guneshu cha visachittam abhikshnam gunasevaya gunascha chitta prabhava madrupa upayam tyajat. Translation. A person has thus achieved me by understanding that he is not different from me. Realize that the material mind is lodged within the sense objects because of constant sense gratification, and that the material objects are existing prominently within the material mind. Having understood my transcendental nature, he gives up both the material mind and its objects. Purport. The Lord again states here that it is most difficult to separate the material mind from its objects, because the material mind by definition considers itself to be the doer and enjoyer of everything. It must be understood that giving up the material mind does not mean giving up all mental activities, but instead means purifying the mind and engaging one's enlightened mentality in the devotional service of the Lord. Since time immemorial, the material mind and senses have been in contact with the sense objects. Therefore, how is it possible for the material mind to give up its objects, which are the basis of its existence? Not only does the mind reach out to material objects, but also because of the mind's desires, the material objects cannot remain out of the mind, helplessly entering at every moment. Thus, separation between the mind and sense objects is not actually feasible, nor does it serve any purpose. If one retains a material mentality, considering oneself to be supreme, one may renounce sense gratification, considering it to be ultimately the cause of unhappiness, but one will not be able to remain on such an artificial platform, nor will such renunciation serve any real purpose. Without surrender to the lotus feet of the Lord, mere renunciation cannot take one out of this material world. Just as the sun's rays are part of the sun, the living entities are part of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When the living entity is completely absorbed in his identity as the part and parcel of the Personality of Godhead, he becomes actually wise and easily gives up the material mind and sense objects. The word madrupa in this verse indicates absorption of the mind in the form, qualities, pastimes, and associates of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Immersed in such ecstatic meditation, one should render devotional service to the Lord, and this will automatically drive away the influence of sense gratification. By himself, the living entity does not have the potency to give up his false identification with the material mind and sense objects, but by worshipping the Lord in the mode of being his eternal part and parcel servant, one is infused with the Lord's potency, which easily drives away the darkness of ignorance. Text 27. Jagrat swapnaha sushuptam cha gunato buddhi vrittayah tasam vilakshano jivaha sakshitvena vinishchitaha. Translation. Waking, sleeping, and deep sleep are the three functions of the intelligence and are caused by the modes of material nature. The living entity within the body is ascertained to possess characteristics different from these three states, and thus remains as a witness to them. Purport: the spirit soul actually has nothing to do with the material world, having no permanent or natural relationship with it. Real renunciation means to give up the illusory identification with matter in its subtle and gross forms. Sushuptam or deep sleep indicates sleeping without any dreams or conscious activity. These three states are described by Lord Krishna as follows: Sattva jagaranam vidyat, rajasa swapnam hadishet, prashvapam tamasa jantos, turiyam trishu santatam. One should know that wakefulness is born of the mode of goodness, dreams from the mode of passion, and deep dreamless sleep from the mode of ignorance. The fourth element, pure consciousness, is different from these three and pervades them. Real freedom means sakshitvena, or to exist as a witness to the functions of illusion. Such an advantageous position is achieved by development of Krishna consciousness. Text 28. Yarhi samrishti bandhoyam atmano gunavrittidaha mai turye stito jahyat tyagastat gunachetasam. Translation: the spirit soul is trapped in the bondage of material intelligence, which awards him constant engagement in the illusory modes of nature. But I am the fourth stage of consciousness, beyond wakefulness, dreaming, and deep sleep. Becoming situated in me, the soul should give up the bondage of material consciousness. At that time, the living entity will automatically renounce the material sense objects and the material mind. Purport: Lord Krishna now specifically answers the questions that the sage originally placed before Lord Brahmā. Ultimately, the spirit soul has nothing to do with the material sense objects and modes of nature, but because of one's false identification with the material body, the modes of nature are empowered to engage one in illusory occupations. By destroying this false identification with matter, the soul gives up the illusory occupations awarded by the modes of nature. It is clearly stated in this verse that the living entity is not empowered to independently free himself from illusion, but must situate himself in Krishna consciousness, in full awareness of the Supreme Lord. Text 29. Ahankara kritam bandham atmanurta viparyayam vidvan nirvidya samsara Chintam turiye stitas tyajet. Translation: the false ego of the living entity places him in bondage and awards him exactly the opposite of what he really desires. Therefore, an intelligent person should give up his constant anxiety to enjoy material life and remain situated in the Lord, who is beyond the functions of material consciousness. Purport: Srila Sridhar Swami comments as follows: how does material existence cause the bondage of the living entity, and how can such bondage be given up? The Lord explains this here by the word ahankara kritam. Because of false ego, one is bound up in the network of illusion. Artha viparyayam indicates that although the living entity desires blissful life, eternity, and knowledge, he adopts procedures that actually cover over his eternal blissful nature and gives him exactly the opposite result. The living entity does not want death and suffering, but these are actually the results of material existence, which is therefore useless for all practical purposes. An intelligent person should contemplate the unhappiness of material life and thus become situated in the transcendental Lord. The word samsara chintam can be understood as follows: Samsara, or material existence, indicates material intelligence. Because material existence only occurs because of the living entity's false intellectual identification with the material world. Because of this misidentification, one becomes overwhelmed with samsara chintam, anxiety to enjoy the material world. One should become situated in the Lord and give up such useless anxiety. Text 13. Yavananarthadhihi pumso na nivartite yuktibihi jagarti api swapanna sapne jagaranam yatha. Translation. According to my instructions, one should fix the mind on me alone. If, however, one continues to see many different values and goals in life rather than seeing everything within me, then although apparently awake, one is actually dreaming due to incomplete knowledge, just as one may dream that one has wakened from a dream. Purport. One who is not Krishna conscious cannot understand that everything is resting within Lord Krishna, and thus it is impossible for him to retire from material sense gratification. One may adopt a particular process of salvation and consider oneself to be saved, nevertheless his material condition will remain, and thus he will maintain his attachment to the material world. While one is dreaming, he sometimes imagines that he has awakened from a dream and is experiencing normal consciousness. Similarly, one may consider oneself to be saved, but if he remains absorbed in making material value judgments between good and bad, without reference to devotion service to the Supreme Lord, he is understood to be a conditioned soul covered by the illusory identification with matter. Text 31. Asatvadat atmano nyesham bhavanam tatkritabhida gatayo hitavaschasya mrisha swapna drisho yatha. Translation. Those states of existence that are conceived of as separate from the Supreme Personality of Godhead have no actual existence, although they create a sense of separation from the Absolute Truth. Those states of existence that are conceived of as separate from the Supreme Lord of Godhead, Supreme Personality of Godhead, have no actual existence, although they create a sense of separation from the Absolute Truth. Just as the seer of a dream imagines many different activities and rewards, similarly, because of the sense of an existence separate from the Lord's existence, the living entity falsely performs fruitive activities, thinking them to be the cause of future rewards and destinations. Purport. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur comments as follows. Although Lord Krishna in his form as Haṁsa-avatāra has condemned the intelligence that sees duality and separate values within the material world, the Vedas themselves institute the system of varnashram dharma by which the entire human society is divided into different castes, occupations, and spiritual statuses. Therefore, how can the Lord recommend that one give up one's faith in this Vedic system? The answer is given in this verse as follows. The words Anyesham Bhavanam, or of other states of existence, refer to the innumerable divisions of false identification with the material body, mind, occupation, and so on. Such identification is illusion, and the material divisions of the varnashram system are certainly based on this illusion. The Vedic literatures promise heavenly rewards such as residence in upper planetary systems and prescribe the means to acquire such rewards. However, both the rewards and the means for achieving them are ultimately illusion. Since this world is the Lord's creation, one cannot deny that its existence is also real. Yet the living entity who identifies the creations of this world as belonging to himself is certainly an illusion. The example may be given that horns are real and rabbits are real, but if one imagines a rabbit's horns, that is certainly illusion. Though a rabbit's horns may occur in a dream, so the living entity dreams a permanent relationship within the material world. One may dream that one is feasting on sumptuous sweet rice prepared with milk and sugar, but there is no actual nutritional value in the dream of royal feasting. Śrīla Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur remarks in this regard that just as one soon forgets the experience of a dream after awakening, similarly the liberated soul in Krishna consciousness does not see anything substantial in even the most exalted rewards offered by the Vedas, such as promotion to the heavenly planets. Therefore Lord Krishna advised Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita to remain fixed in self-realization without being deviated by fruited rituals performed in the name of religion. Text 32. Yo jaga jagare bahir anupshana dharminodhan bhukte samasta karanhair kriti tat sadrikshan satne shushupta upasammarate se psaikaha smriti anvayatri gunavriti drik indriye yeshaha. Translation. While awake, the living entity enjoys with all of his senses the fleeting characteristics of the material body and mind. While dreaming, he enjoys similar experiences within the mind, and in deep dreamless sleep all such experiences merge into ignorance. By remembering and contemplating the succession of wakefulness, dreaming, and deep sleep, the living entity can understand that he is one throughout the three stages of consciousness and is transcendental. Thus he becomes the lord of the senses. Purport. In verse 30 of this chapter, Lord Krishna stated that one must retire from material duality by the proper means, which the Lord now explains. One may first consider the three phases of consciousness mentioned above, and then understands one's own transcendental position as spirit soul. One experiences childhood, boyhood, adolescence, adulthood, middle age, and old age, and throughout these phases, one is experiencing things while awake and while dreaming. Similarly, one may, by careful intelligence, understand one's lack of consciousness during deep sleep, and thus through intelligence one may have experience of lack of consciousness. One may argue that it is actually the senses that experience during wakefulness, and that it is the mind that experiences during dreams. However, the Lord here states, Indriye Saha, the living entity is actually the Lord of the senses and mind, although temporarily he has become a victim of their influence. By Krishna consciousness one may resume one's rightful position as master of the mental and sensory faculties. Although since the living entity can remember his experiences in these three stages of consciousness, he is ultimately the experiencing agent or the seer of all phases of consciousness. He remembers, I saw so many things in my dream, and then my dream ended and I didn't see anything. Now I am waking up. This universal experience can be understood by everyone, and thus everyone can understand that one's actual identity is separate from the material body and mind. Text 33. Evam vimrishya gunato manasastriyavasta. Evam vimrishya gunato manasastriyavasta. Manmaya maya krita iti nishchitartaha. Sanchitya hardam anumana sadukti tikshna jnanasina bhajata makila samsayiyatim. Translation. You should consider how by the influence of my leisure energy, these three states of the mind, caused by the modes of nature, have been artificially imagined to exist in me. Having definitely ascertained the truth of the soul, we should utilize the sharpened sword of knowledge acquired by logical reflection and from the instructions. Having definitely ascertained the truth of the soul, you should utilize the sharpened sword of knowledge acquired by logical reflection and from the instructions of sages and Vedic literatures to completely cut off the false ego, which is the breeding ground of all doubts. All of you should then worship me, who am situated within the heart. Purport. One who has obtained transcendental knowledge is no longer dependent on the three stages of ordinary consciousness, namely waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep. One thus rids one's material mind of the tendency to become the enjoyer of the inferior energy of the Lord. And one sees everything as part and parcel of the Lord's potency, meant only for the enjoyment of the Lord himself. In such a state of consciousness, one naturally surrenders fully to the Lord's devotional service, which Lord Haṁsa here advises the sons of Lord Brahmā to take up. Text 34. Ikshita vibhramam idam manasa vilasam drishtam vinashtam matilolam alata chakram Vijnanamekam murudheva vibhati maya swapnastridha guna visarga krito vikalpaha. Translation. One should see that the material world is a distinct illusion appearing in the mind, because material objects have an extremely flickering existence and are here today and gone tomorrow. They can be compared to the streaking red line created by whirling a fiery stick. The spirit soul by nature exists in the single state of pure consciousness. However, in this world he appears in many different forms and stages of existence. The modes of nature divide the soul's consciousness into normal wakefulness, dreaming, and dreamless sleep. All such varieties of perception, however, are actually Maya and exist only like a dream. Purport. The Lord now describes an additional process for transcending the illusory interaction of the material mind and material sense objects. Lasa means jumping or dancing, and thus Manaso Vilasam here indicates that the material mind is jumping superficially from one conception of life to another. Our original consciousness, however, is one Vijnanam Ekam. Therefore, one should carefully study the flickering here today, gone tomorrow nature of the material world and detach oneself from the illusory variety of Maya. Text 35. Drishtim tataha pratinivartya nimrita trishnas Tushnim bhavin nija sukhanubhavo nirihaha sandrishyate kvacha yadidam avastu bhutya tyaktam brahmaya na bhavit smritir anipatat. Translation. Having understood the temporary illusory nature of material things, and thus having pulled one's vision away from illusion, one should remain without material desires. By experiencing the happiness of the soul, one should give up material speaking and activities. If sometimes one must observe the material world, one should remember that it is not ultimate reality, and therefore one has given it up. By such constant remembrance up till the time of death, one will not again fall into illusion. Purpose. To maintain the material body, one cannot avoid eating and sleeping. In these and other ways, one will sometimes be forced to deal with the material world and the physical aspects of one's own body. At such times, one should remember that the material world is not actual reality, and that therefore one has given it up to become Krishna conscious. By such constant remembrance, by enjoying spiritual bliss within oneself, and by retiring from any material activities of the mind, speech, or body, one will not fall into material illusion. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur comments as follows. The living entity, while living in the external energy of the Lord, should give up any anxiety for sense gratification, and should not act for his personal enjoyment. Rather, one should search out spiritual bliss through devotional service to the Supreme Lord. By reviving one's relationship with Lord Krishna, one will understand that if one accepts any material object for one's personal enjoyment, attachment will inevitably develop, and thus one will be bewildered by illusion. By gradually developing one's spiritual body, one will no longer desire to enjoy anything within the material world. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur comments as follows: the living entity, while living in the external energy of the Lord, should give up any anxiety for sense gratification, and should not act for his personal enjoyment. Rather, one should search our spiritual bliss through devotional service to the Supreme Lord. By reviving one's relationship with Lord Krishna, one will understand that if one accepts any material object for one's personal enjoyment, attachment will inevitably develop, and thus one will be bewildered by illusion. By gradually developing one's spiritual body, one will no longer desire to enjoy anything within the material world. Text 36. Deham cha nashvaram avasthitam uchitam va siddho na pashyati yato tyagamat swarupam daivadapetam atha daivavasadupetam vaso yatha parikritam madhira madantha. Translation: just as a drunken man does not notice if he is wearing his coat or shirt, similarly one who is perfect in self-realization and who has thus achieved his eternal identity does not notice whether the temporary body is sitting or standing. Indeed, if by God's will the body is finished, or if by God's will he obtains a new body, a self-realized soul does not notice, just as a drunken man does not notice the situation of his outward dress. Purport: the Krishna-conscious person who has achieved his spiritual identity does not accept sense gratification in the material world as the goal of his life. He is constantly engaged in the service of the Lord and knows that the temporary body and flickering mind are material. By superior intelligence and Krishna consciousness, he remains engaged in the Lord's service. The example of a drunken man in this verse is very nice. It is common knowledge that at mundane social gathering men become drunk and lose all awareness of their external situation. Similarly, a liberated soul has already achieved his spiritual body and therefore knows that his continued existence does not depend on the material body. A liberated soul does not, however, inflict punishment on the body, but rather remains neutral, naturally accepting his destiny as the will of the Supreme. Text 37. Dehopi daivavasagaha khalu karmayavat svarambhakam pratisamikshata eva sashuho tam suprapancham athirutha samadhi yogaha Swapnam punarna bhajate pratibuddha vastuhu. Translation: the material body certainly moves under the control of supreme destiny, and therefore must continue to live along with the senses and vital air as long as one's karma is in effect. A self-realized soul, however, who is awakened to the absolute reality and who is thus highly situated in the perfect stage of yoga, will never again surrender to the material body and its manifold manifestations, knowing it to be just like a body visualized in a dream. Purport: although Lord Krishna recommended in the previous verse that a self-realized soul not give attention to the body, it is clear from the Lord's statement here that one should not foolishly starve or injure the body, but should patiently wait until the chain of one's spiritual work has completely exhausted itself. At that time, the body will automatically die according to destiny. The following doubt may then arise: if a Krishna-conscious person pays proper attention to the maintenance of the body, is there danger of again becoming attached to it? Lord Krishna here states that one who is highly elevated in Krishna consciousness, having understood Lord Krishna to be the actual Vastu or reality, never again surrenders to the illusory identification within the material body, which is just like the body seen in a dream. Text 38. Mayaitad uktam vo vipra guhyam yat sankhya yogayoho janitamaagatam yagyam yushmat dharma vivakshaya. Translation. My dear Brahmins, I have now explained to you the confidential knowledge of Sankhya, by which one philosophically distinguishes matter from spirit, and of Ashtanga Yoga, by which one links up with the Supreme. Please understand that I am the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vishnu, and that I have appeared before you desiring to explain your actual religious duties. Purport: to increase the faith of Lord Brahma's sons and establish the prestige of his teachings, Lord Krishna formally identifies himself as the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vishnu. As stated in Vedic literature, Yagyo Vai Vishnu, after explaining the Sankhya and Ashtanga Yoga systems, the Lord clearly answers the original question of the sage, who are you serve? Thus Lord Brahma and his sons were enlightened by Lord Haṁsa. Text 39. Aham yogasya sankyasya satyasya artasya tejahasah paryanam dvijasrishtaha shriyaha kirtirdamasya cha. Translation. O best of the Brahmins, please know that I am the supreme shelter of the yoga system, analytic philosophy, virtuous action, truthful religious principles, power, beauty, fame, and self-control. Purport. According to Srila Sridhar Swami, the synonymous words satyasa and tasya refer to respectively the proper or virtuous execution of religious principles and a convincing presentation of religion. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur points out that the sons of Brahma were struck with wonder at the presentation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and were thinking, "What wonderful knowledge we have just heard!" The Lord, recognizing their astonishment, spoke these words to confirm their understanding of Him. Text 40. Mam bhajanti gunaha sarve nirgunam nirapekshatam suhridam priyamatmanam samyasangadayo gunaha. Translation. All superior transcendental qualities, such as being beyond the modes of nature, detached, the well-wisher, the most dear, the super-soul, equally situated everywhere, and free from material entanglement, all such qualities, free from the transformations of material qualities, find their shelter and worshipable object in me. Purport. Because in the previous verse Lord Krishna explained his exalted nature, the sons of Brahma might have slightly doubted the Lord's position, thinking that they had detected some pride within the Lord's mind. Therefore they may have doubted the instructions they had just received from Lord Haṁsa. Anticipating any such reluctance, the Lord immediately clarifies the situation in the present verse. The Lord explains that unlike ordinary living entities even up to the standard of Brahma, the Lord's transcendental body is not different from his eternal self and has no material qualities such as false egotism. The Lord's transcendental form is eternal, full of knowledge and bliss, and is thus nirgunam, beyond the modes of nature. Because the Lord completely ignores the so-called enjoyment offered by the illusory energy, he is called nirapekshakam, and being the best well-wisher of his devotees, he is called suhridam. Priyam indicates that the Lord is the supreme lovable object, and that he establishes wonderful affectionate relationships with his devotees. Samya indicates that the Lord is neutral and detached in all material situations. These and other exalted qualities find their shelter and worshipable object in the Lord, who does not take material designations into consideration but awards his mercy to anyone who takes shelter of him. In Srimad Bhagavatam, Mother Bhumi, the predominating deity of the earth, gives a list of some of the Lord's transcendental qualities, and even more are found in the Nectar of Devotion. Actually, the Lord's qualities are unlimited, but a small sample is given here simply to establish the Lord's transcendental position. Srimad Bhagavatam is quoted from the Kala Samhita as follows: the demigods are not actually perfectly endowed with transcendental qualities. Indeed, their opulences are limited, and therefore they worship the Supreme Personality of God in absolute truth, who is simultaneously free of all material qualities and completely endowed with all transcendental qualities which exist in his personal body. Text 41. Iti me chinna sandeha munayaha sanakadayaha sabhajayitva praraya bhaktya prunata samstavaihi. Translation. Lord Krishna continued, My dear Uddhava, thus all of the doubts of the sage headed by Sanaka were destroyed by my words. Fully worshipping me with transcendental love and devotion, they chanted my glories with exalted hymns. Text 42. Tairaham pujitaha samyak samstutvaha paramarshibhi pratyaya swakam dhamam pashyataha parameshtinaha. Translation. The greatest of sages, headed by Sanaka Rishi, thus perfectly worshipped and glorified me, and as Lord Brahmā looked on, I returned to my own abode. Thus end the purports of the humble servants of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada to the 11th Canto, 13th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled The Haṁsa-avatāra answers the questions of the sons of Brahmā.